Hello and welcome to Parrot Analytics' fifth annual Global Demand Awards, where we highlight the most in-demand talent, TV, and movies of 2022. Today, I am joined by Casey Bloys, Chairman and CEO of HBO and HBO Max. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
So first question, most important of the interview, Casey, you're from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So if I have 24 hours, am I hitting the Steel Stacks Art Gallery? Am I going to the National Museum of Industrial History? Or is it the Godfrey Daniels Theater? What is the go-to move?
Well, I will age myself here and tell you when I left Bethlehem 30 some years ago, the steel plant was still a plant, not a casino or a venue. So I actually haven't been there. So I don't have good recommendations for you. And probably the bars that I liked are all closed at this point. So I don't have up-to-date recommendations for you.
Fair enough. I know they must miss you, though, at this point.
Maybe. We'll see. I don't know.
All right. To jump into it, Casey, when we hold up our magnifying glass to the entertainment industry, particularly over the last 5 years, we see a rush to deliver more and more content, largely all at once, to audiences. But even as HBO and HBO Max have strategically increased the number of titles developed, Sunday nights remain prime linear real estate, and your biggest titles, including Global Demand Award finalists House of the Dragon, Euphoria, and Peacemaker, remain largely weekly releases. So I'm curious, how have you balanced charging into this new era of direct-to-consumer entertainment that we find ourselves in, while still holding on to some of the long-running industry strategies?
Well, I think you're right that there is, with some of the new entrants, tech players, there is this mentality of we need more, fill the slate. And I get it because they've been playing a lot of catch up. I do think one of the advantages that we have at HBO anyway is, the HBO brand is something that has built over the last 50 years. It takes a lot of time. And it is something I do believe we've earned the trust of viewers that if we're putting something out, people will say, "Oh, this is good." You can't take that for granted, and it's not anything we take for granted. But it usually means, oh, this will be interesting, this will be controversial, this will push the envelope, this will be cinematic, whatever. There's a lot of different ways to define that. But HBO standing for something is not only useful for a subscriber if we don't, blow it. Everybody has shows that don't work, of course, and that's going to happen. But it's also useful for us internally. When we're developing shows and we're thinking about shows and we're thinking about what shows to put on, to have that North Star and to have that brand that represents something, it helps us ask, is this show good enough? If you don't have that, it's much easier to say, it's fine. Put it on. So I do think there's something maybe in the DNA of how we think about things, that it's helpful to have that North Star. And remember, we have been asking people to pay for TV for 50 years. So you kind of instinctively in the development process, and when you think about what someone might like, we've been very conscious of, we're asking people to pay extra. So how does this deliver? And again, that's what we talked about. There's a lot of different ways to define that. What is extra? What is interesting? What is something that's not out there? But I think it's a very helpful tool that we have that others don't. Now other people have different brands. FX has a really good brand, and I think they have a North Star that they shoot for. So I think that is helpful regardless of what's going on. If you think about, I've been at HBO for 18 years, and our competitors have been. It was Showtime was going to take us down, and then Stars for a minute, and of course Netflix, and you have Apple and Amazon. Everybody's everybody's doing good shows, but to some extent, you have to block that out and think about that HBO brand and the North Star. And that's what we try to do, is just focus on that.
The HBO brand remains one of the most powerful entities in all of entertainment. Like you mentioned, you've been there since 2004. You know more about it than anybody. It's why you've got the top job. But, in a related way, if we look at HBO Max's roster over the last 12 months, you're also releasing less than your primary SVOD rivals, but the majority of series are receiving good or even outstanding levels of audience demand in the US, according to Parrot Analytics data. Quality, as you mentioned, It's always been the defining trait of the HBO brand, but how have you managed to maintain that in the streaming age with a push for more, notably without diluting the HBO brand?
Well, you know, I'm fortunate in that I have a team at HBO and I have a team at HBO Max. So you're not asking one team to do all of it. So that's important. And I think making sure that everybody knows what their job is. You know, what I always say about HBO is myself, my colleagues, you know, all my creative heads, we've all been at HBO a minimum of 18 years. We've all worked together a long time. They're not changing anything. I don't want them to change anything about how they operate, other than the normal course of being at HBO. You have to always constantly evolve and think about, like, what is an HBO show? So that's a natural process. For Max, I think if you look at shows like Sex Lives of College Girls or Pretty Little Liars or Flight Attendant, Peacemaker, we're trying to broaden out beyond HBO. And I think one of the advantages we have is, you know, a couple like Peacemaker, a big DC title from a very talented James Gunn, new head of DC Studios, and Pretty Little Liars, which is a really important piece of IP from the Warner Brothers library, and Sex Lives of College Girls from Mindy Kaling. You know, Warner Brothers has a big deal with her. So we've got an advantage as a company that we have all of that IP and all those deals at Warner Brothers that can help us go broader, younger, different demographics. You know, the DC and Game of Thrones audiences, for example, are not, there is some overlap, but not a lot. So I think it's important as we develop and move forward that the HBO team has their mission and the HBO Max team has their mission. But, you know, we have the same idea of how to develop and taking our time and getting it right.
I may not represent every single viewer you're trying to reach, but I can say from my perspective, mission accomplished in the way that I jumped from Flight Attendants to Hacks, Sex Life of College Girls, to Peacemaker, to an animated DC cartoon from, 20 years ago. So the breadth of content has kept me hooked. So, you're my subscriber money is safe. You don't have to worry about that. I know you were losing sleep over that.
But you don't want to take it for granted. You know, that's the thing. You can never, just because you like it doesn't mean you're going to like it a year from now. So, but I think you're going to like Last of Us. So I'll at least keep you through March.
Yeah, that's a pretty safe bet. And then we've got Succession, which,
And then you got Succession. Yeah. And then I got The Idol after that. So I think we have you hooked for a little while.
There we go. And I'm glad you mentioned that you still have to evolve the thought process of what an HBO show is, because I am curious. You guys have said you've been there entrenched since about 2004, but as Hollywood attempts to balance linear with streaming, has the development process changed at all as new mediums, new generations of fans, new content trends continue to emerge, cement themselves?
No, not a development process has not changed at all. I don't think a good show is a good show is a good show, and developing a good show can be different depending on who you're working with. I don't think it's helpful to think about, is this a linear or a streaming show? I think you want to make a good show. So the process hasn't changed. Certain shows, like genres you want to get into or not get into, that certainly evolves, but how you make TV and how you develop and how you treat creators, that to me it should be a constant.
Yeah, it's an inherent relationship business. And I think people can tend to forget that when we are surfing this extreme wave of content over the last few years. And you guys seem to have navigated that quite well. Now, to piggyback off that last question, though, companies now know so much more about their audience than they did before. Their favorite genres, the hours of usage per day, viewer demographic information. How, if at all, does the volume of data at your disposal change the development process from the inside?
Again, not at all. Because remember, I'll tell you where data is helpful, but where it's not helpful, and data is backward looking. It can never tell you that White Lotus is going to be a hit. It can never tell you that Euphoria is going to be a hit. It can never tell you that Flight Attendant is work. There's no way it can do that. But what it can, so on an individual show basis, we don't test shows. We don't, because nobody can tell you. But where it can be helpful is when you're thinking about overall slate allocation. Generally speaking, for example, dramas tend to be the most expensive genre of show or spending. If I'm spending the majority of my dollars on drama, I should be seeing the majority of engagement and or first views from drama. If I'm not, I mean, it's not totally apples to apples, but just generally speaking, if I'm not seeing a commensurate level, there's something off. And data can go through your slate and say, you know, do we have the right level of spending in drama, comedy, docs, movies, first run show, syndicated shows. So it can be very helpful that way in terms of getting your slate to the right levels or the right combination. And I think that's really the holy grail that I don't think anybody has perfected, which is what is the right amount of spending with the right combination of shows and genres that attracts and retains the most amount of subscribers. And I think that is constantly evolving based on the shows you have, but you can take some very basic, as I say, slate performance and kind of adjust where you're spending.
So yeah, it's more
data is helpful there, not on an individual title basis. Forward looking, backward looking, yes. You know, when you're thinking about what show to renew, at what level, you know, it's all performance at that point.
So it's this holistic macro view that you're leveraging. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But if we did want to zoom in on an individual title basis, Euphoria is a finalist for the most in-demand drama series of 2022. HBO has historically drawn older male audiences, but Euphoria skews decidedly younger and more female. I'm curious, was this a concentrated effort to expand HBO's audience demographic? And if so, what other considerations are given when attempting to attract a whole new subset of viewers?
Well, as I mentioned before, part of evolving HBO is, you know, as I said, we're always thinking about like, what does it stand for? What is an HBO show? You know, it's what are we asking people to pay for? Part of what you do is ask, well, what's not on TV at the moment? You know, it's a constant question. What haven't we tried before? Why haven't we tried it? And you're right. Historically, HBO has skewed more male, partly because of boxing, partly because of first run movies. Even though we've had female skewing shows over the years like Sex and the City. But one of the things we really did try to do was, all right, I think any programming looks at their mix and says, if you've got an over-index of men, maybe we should try to bring in some women. If you've got too many women, maybe we should, you know, you always want to have, in my mind, a balanced portfolio. One of the things that was interesting with the show Girls at that point, is that 10 years ago now? I've kind of lost track of time, but at that point, that was the youngest show that we had done. And the idea was, you know, the old kind of conventional wisdom at HBO was, well, the head of the household pays for cable. So young people aren't deciding whether to get cable or not. And obviously that has changed over the years. But when we were developing Girls, it was like, I don't know, you know, a show about, you know, people in their 20s, you know, we had never done that. And I think I love high school shows. I've always loved high school shows. So I was drawn to Euphoria for that reason. Obviously, it was the idea with it was, yes, it'll be a younger skewing show, but it also is a pretty serious, you know, it's a pretty serious subject matter. And so if we were going to do a high school show, what would that look like? What would it tackle? And I think Euphoria answers that, you know, really well. But yes, it was a deliberate question of what would a high school show look like for us? What would happen if we put a show that skewed that young on? And what happened was we have the youngest skewing show in the history of HBO. So you kind of, that's what I mean about like constantly thinking about HBO, pushing things, trying things. It's hopefully part of what we do.
Now, of course, Zendaya came up through the Disney Channel shows, but I think most people would agree that her broader mainstream breakout was Euphoria. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank you and HBO for the gift that is Zendaya, because that's providing a real service to humanity right there.
I think that she has gone on to be probably one of the biggest movie stars of her generation. So, and she deserves it. She's great.
As a result, you can add philanthropy to your job description.
Yes, I'll say
so much appreciated, sir. Switching gears, House of the Dragon is HBO's first ever spinoff as the network continues to franchise the Game of Thrones property. It is a finalist for most in-demand series debut of 2022. Now, we have seen Disney deliver a steady diet of Marvel and Star Wars series. Paramount Plus has a growing roster of Star Trek shows, but you and your team have opted not to move forward with another spin-off pilot previously, and you're taking your time with the ideas currently in development to expand the franchise. What is your mindset behind frequency and building on that franchise brand?
Well, remember, unlike with Disney, Game of Thrones is one part of a larger offering on HBO. So we continue, whether it's, Game of Thrones is a franchise, of course, but it is among shows like Mayor of Easttown or Succession or White Lotus, shows that are not franchise shows. So it's not like it's Game of Thrones or nothing, but it's obviously Game of Thrones is a very valuable franchise for us. The thing I think about development, you see this sometimes in features where they'll say, we need a movie, July 4th, 3 years out. Come hell or high water, there's going to be a movie there. And sometimes that works brilliantly. Everything comes together and you got a huge, hit movie. But sometimes having a predetermined, we're going to have this, can allow you to make compromises that you otherwise wouldn't. And I always want to avoid that. So my approach with Game of Thrones from the beginning has been, remember, when we decided to do a prequel or sequel, whatever, HBO had never really done spinoffs. So this was there were a lot of people internally who were like, what are you doing? But it was just too big a world not to try. But what I didn't want to do was say it is preordained. We will have 3 Game of Thrones series per year for the next, or whatever the formula is, because I think that can lead to making decisions that you otherwise wouldn't have made. So our attitude is always, we will develop multiple scripts, and if they're good, we will make them, and if they're not, we won't. And I think any sort of pressure outside of that is not helpful. So we're just trying to keep it focused on the quality of the scripts.
I do appreciate and respect the restraint, because as a massive Game of Thrones nerd myself, I would dive into literally anything that you put out there. And to be able to rein that in despite knowing the built-in fan base and focus on building it strategically, making sure that HBO brand quality is at the forefront is, it shows a measure of calculation that perhaps in this era of more and more is not always present.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. Now, sticking with franchises, you did mention Peacemaker earlier. It's one of the 5 most in-demand superhero shows of 2022. It was originally made before creator James Gunn joined DC Studios as co-CEO. Now, we know tentpole dramas and franchises, they tend to travel well, and we've seen a plethora of DC content succeed on the small screen recently. As you play this less is more game with Game of Thrones strategically, can we expect HBO and HBO Max to lean more on DC moving forward to kind of better provide global appeal?
Yeah, one of the things, first, let me say on Peacemaker, I had a fantastic experience with James and Peter making that show. It was smooth and funny and great, and they did a fantastic job. So when they were announced as head of DC Studios, I was thrilled because I had a really good working relationship with them, and I really like the idea of James as a creative coming in and setting the roadmap for DC. One of the things that we talked about is with something as big as DC, you got films, you've got animated shows like Harley Quinn, you got Doom Patrol and Titan. You have so much stuff. It covers so much. I think one of the things you have to do, at least on a streaming service, it's a little bit, we were talking about, like, what's the ultimate combination to keep fans engaged? What's the right combination of big DC shows, animated shows, library shows, library movies? What's the right combination so that you're not overspending on DC, you're not underserving the fans, you're keeping them engaged? And we're trying to figure out what is that right cadence. And that's part of what James is laying out with his plan. What will be movies, what will be TV shows, when will they come out, and all that kind of stuff. So trying to be careful about what that looks like. And that's one of the reasons why I think it was why it's great to have a unified voice there, because DC was so big, you had a lot of different people coming at it. Well, I'll do a TV show over here, and I'll do a movie here, and I'll do an animated show. And so I think to have one person, especially creative, kind of overseeing all of it, I think is a really, really good thing for us.
So to stick with that for a second, the DC audience doesn't necessarily overlap cleanly with the HBO audience historically. Have you seen that begun to change recently as the superhero genre continues evolving and HBO itself adds Watchmen, one of the most celebrated entries in the superhero genre?
There's definitely the DC audience. There's not a whole lot of overlap, as I said, with Game of Thrones. But we do see when people come in for DC, typically they'll come in, they'll watch other DC stuff, but they tend to also watch what's freshest and new in terms of series or pay one movies. So it's still somewhat new. So I can say that, all DC fans have been converted and they all love HBO, but there's definitely sampling going on. Mostly they'll come in for DC, check out other DC stuff, and will typically then watch what's new and fresh on Max in terms of series and other movies outside of the DC universe.
That makes sense. It's a constant funnel that I'm sure you're building up at all times.
Yeah.
Now, zooming out, we talked a little bit about this throughout this conversation, this era of more. Content spend has become a very popular focus of the industry this year. I'm curious, what are the checklist of factors that you and your teams consider when it comes to allocation of resources?
Well, it goes back to always that holy grail, which is what is the right amount to keep people engaged. I don't know if checklist is the right word, but you want to make sure that you at least have enough to engage audiences. So there's handoffs between major pieces of content, whether it's new series or pay one movies or animated shows. And remember, we're very lucky that we have kind of stalwarts like Friends and Game of Thrones, the original, the HBO library, Big Bang Theory. Shows like that are constantly in our top 10, both in terms of engagement and first views. So you balance that with new offerings. I think you just want to make sure that you have enough to serve audiences throughout the year, that there's not huge content gaps. And then again, the question always becomes, you don't want to overspend, you don't want to underspend. It's trying to figure out how to get it just right. And some of that also becomes a show may overperform and do much better than you thought it was going to do, or a show, that you were all sure was going to do really well doesn't. So it's kind of trying to estimate as best you can what the year looks like, and do we have enough content in all those genres to keep people engaged and on the service. I don't know, again, I don't know if anybody has perfected that, but it's a constant process of trying to analyze and figure it out.
That's the 2023 New Year's resolution, right? We're going to
just figure it out. Yes.
I'm glad that you mentioned shows like Friends and Big Bang Theory, because we've seen how beloved linear series like those, like South Park, like Rick and Morty, remain incredibly popular on HBO Max. So what do you think broadcast and basic cable networks what role do you think they have to play in the current TV landscape, as everyone seemingly seems to put them on the back burner to a certain extent?
Well, listen, those businesses are challenged, no question. And so, whether original series can survive, particularly on basic cable, I know it's tough because you've got declining ad revenue and affiliate revenue. So it's a tough thing. But I will say, I'm thrilled that Warner Brothers has Abbott Elementary and that it's airing and getting a big audience, because that's a show that 10 years from now is going to be a very important part of the HBO Max streaming library, where, whatever it's called at that point. But so to have broadcast networks are big platforms. They're still, they still do relatively well. I'm saying when you kind of compare the landscape, I'm not saying we're still in the must-see TV Thursdays or anything like that, but they're still valuable platforms to have people sample shows. So if Warner Brothers can build an important comedy outside of our ecosystem and then it lives in ours, I'm a big fan of that. One of the challenges I think we have in comedy is there used to be an incentive for studios to get to 100 episodes, the syndication pot of gold. When that motivation is taken away, there's not an incentive to stay with a show that, you know, could evolve and turn into something. I remember when The Office was on the air, I think maybe after the third season was like, oh, this show's going to get canceled. It's not doing well. But I don't know. I wasn't involved, but I would imagine, you know, part of the motivation to do more was, well, if we get to 100 episodes, it's a big payday. So with that gone, that incentive gone, I do think it is going to affect the ability to have the Big Bang theories and Friends and things like that. So the network development system, I worked in it early in my career, definitely had its downsides, but it also has its upsides. And, you know, you have these shows 20, 30 years later that are still doing big business. So I'm not sure how we rectify that. But again, I'm glad in the short term that Abbott Elementary is working and we're going to get it on our air.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that that is a title that you specifically call out, given just how utterly delightful it is. So to know that that's going to live in the Warner Brothers library for a long term, that's got to be a nice, you know, synergy between what you're doing on the streaming side and what's still going on in the most familiar TV broadcast landscape. Now, last question, I'll get you out of here because I selfishly want you and the team getting back to work on House of the Dragon season 2.
Yes.
I want to take up more of your time. That disrupts that. In terms of content genres, HBO and HBO Max have their bases covered incredibly well globally. So I am curious, where is the white space opportunity for you? You know, what has HBO and HBO Max not done yet that you'd really like to see?
Well, so what's interesting is, you know, obviously you guys are probably aware of the debate we're having around what to call the new service. And obviously, as someone coming from HBO, I highly value the HBO brand, and I think it's great. But there is some truth to the fact that if you're a parent with kids, you may not automatically think, oh, HBO, that's the place I'm going to park my kid in front of, you know.
We all love Sesame Street, but it's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I do think that family viewing for a broad-based streaming service is important. That is one of the factors we're thinking about as we think about, like, what's the right, what do we call this? How do we market it? So that's why I say it would be surprising if I didn't give you that context to just say, oh, you know, kids. We have a great kids library from Warner Brothers Cartoon Network. I think part of the problem was spending on originals at this point when we have, you know, the HBO title in our name. There's a natural kind of block there. So I think until we figure out what the combined product looks like and how it's marketed, we kind of wanted to pause on the kids stuff besides the library. But that is a white space in general. I think any streaming service has got to have family appeal, because as you guys know, you know, if you're a subscriber, you want to feel that you're getting your money's worth. And one way to do that is that everybody in the family is using it. So I don't know what that's going to translate to. I know we have great kids resources within Warner Brothers Discovery, but obviously we got to get to the new combined product.
Well, we are very excited to see how that all plays out. We are going to be, like you said, you've got my subscription dollars locked and loaded, so you don't have to worry here. Casey, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Really appreciate it. And like we said,
of course,
nice to see all that's to come.
Excellent. Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Thank you as well.
I hope you enjoyed that video from our Global Demand Awards Virtual Festival. Reach out to us today and find out why some of the largest organizations around the globe are partnering with Parrot Analytics to solve some of their most pressing problems.